What is a dirty fact about history that school never taught you? Benjamin Franklin cheated on his wife all the time and tried to plow his friends' wives. He wrote a tract that explained in detail why he liked to sleep with older women, like grandmother-aged older women. If the affair should happen to be known, considerate people might be rather inclined to excuse an old woman, who would kindly take care of a young man, form his manners by her good counsels, and prevent his ruining his health and fortune among mercenary call girls. Very smooth, Ben. History cannot be taught in its entirety. That's virtually impossible. Everything learned in history schools is cherry-picked to streamline the knowledge taught and to focus on specific narratives. My history school teacher taught me that history is just the most agreed-upon version of events. Germ theory didn't exist when people were apparently giving germs to Native Americans. Sorry, it's just not a thing the way you present it. They didn't know the cause of the disease, but people have been well aware of how it spread for a long time. See catapulting corpses of the dead animals into cities during sieges. That said, yeah, smallpox blankets weren't an intentional thing. The disabled were institutionalized and essentially locked away, forgotten about by their families and left voiceless to the abuses that went on there. Where I live, near Australia's oldest continuously run insane asylum, which has now closed, it was essentially a prison, but with all of the amenities that patients never had to leave. They never had to be out in the community. One woman who was institutionalized for behavioral issues as a child. When she was finally let out as a young woman, she didn't know how to use traffic lights or money. In other places, disabled people and older kids were tied to a pole or a heater because there weren't enough staff to supervise or give attention to deal with behaviors. There's only been one successful coup in the U.S. On November 10th of 1898, a group of white supremacists overthrew the Wilmington, North Carolina municipal government. The government had been integrated since the end of the Civil War. The coup ended that, and the government started instituting segregation laws. One interesting fact that's not often covered in schools is the role that cats have played in human history. Cats have been valued for their ability to control pests like mice and rats, and have been kept as pets for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, cats were even considered sacred, and were often depicted in art and religion. However, the domestication of cats is thought to have originated in the Near East, where they were first kept for their ability to control rodents that infested grain stores. Most of the stuff that happened in history isn't normally taught, just by necessity. This is also from my experience in the US. So just to pick a few, the plague of Justinian. Possibly similar in scope to the Black Death, and likely the same illness. And the Black Death was discussed extensively, but the plague of Justinian, not at all. The conflict between different groups of Native Americans is usually depicted as different tribes living in their respective areas from time immemorial until Europeans arrived, when in reality, different groups conquered different areas at different times. The widespread ethnic cleansing and expulsions that happened after World War II in Europe. The Bronze Age collapse, when there was an enormous collapse of civilization in the Middle East that has never been adequately explained. Anything relating to rights for black people between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. There was actual progress made in the aftermath of the Civil War that got wound back, and earlier efforts at expanding rights for black people weren't very successful. It's not like everyone forgot about that issue for 80 years. The African continent was a hub of cultural, technological, and scientific advancement prior to the arrival of European colonizers. For example, the Kingdom of Mali was one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world in the 13th and 14th centuries, and the city of Timbuktu was a center of learning and commerce. The cities of the great Zimbabwe and Meroe were also centers of advanced civilization and architectural achievement. In ancient Asia, death by elephants was a popular form of execution. As elephants are very intelligent and easy to train, it proved easy enough to train them as executioners and torturers. They could be taught to slowly break bones, crush skulls, twist off limbs, or even execute people using large blades fitted to their tusks. In some parts of Asia, this method of execution was still popular until the late 19th century. The Mexican War for Independence was one of the most brutal in history. Chinese women and Russian women were both granted the right to vote before the Canadian American women and the U.S. American women. Chinese women were granted the right to vote back in 1912 when the Republic of China arose. Russian women were granted the right in 1917, while Canadian American women weren't granted this until 1918, and white U.S. American women weren't granted this right until 1920. British rule, colonization, the horror they inflicted for generations to come and looted people off their lands, they left rich countries in the poorest state. British colonialism in India led to the extinction of over 100 million people in 4 decades. They were worse than Mustache Man. The fact that there is a museum in UK showing items from different countries like Venezuela, India, Brazil, and many other African countries is nothing but a theft show. In 842, the kings of the West and East Francia met in Strasbourg to make some sort of an alliance and brought some armies with them. When they promised each other to be faithful, each of them was speaking the Latin language, but the Latin language from East and West was different. This is a monument of an old French language, and also this shows the fact that post-Roman times are going to end up soon, because an integral part of everything Roman Europe had is being exiled by some barbarian things. That Central Park in New York City has made to get rid of the poor black side of town. The blacks owned the land, and it was a safe haven from racism at the time. If I recall correctly, it was called the Seneca Village. It was growing, and they wanted it gone. Hence, let's make a big park. Armenian Genocide. It's such a good example of a government successfully controlling and suppressing information, and it highlights how rhetoric dictates how we feel about atrocities. Casualties of mass deportations doesn't motivate society to act, but if they were rightfully called deaths due to genocide, we'd act a lot differently. I gave a presentation on it, and how U.S. foreign policy is affected by the topic in university, and a Turkish exchange student in my modern Middle East class lost his at me claiming I was a liar. When the British battleship HMS Rodney was sitting in Scapa Flow circa 1940, one of his stokers was starting to get a bit pent up from being out there for too long with nary a woman in sight. So he took it upon himself to have, shall we say, relations with one of the local sheep. He then got stuck and had to be taken to the hospital, and was then court-martialed where he unsuccessfully argued that he thought it was a woman in a duffel coat. The word spread, and thus, for the remainder of her days, every time a British ship passed by Rodney, you could hear the sounds of the ship's crew making bleating noises at her. Didn't matter if he was just sitting in port or going into battle, not exaggerating. HMS King George V's crew did it while they were chasing down Bismarck. She was greeted with a chorus of "Maz" wherever she went. They would also do this to her sister ship HMS Nelson, to the point where she eventually made a fleet-wide announcement to stop making sheep noises at the flagship. Every major important building in Washington, D.C. was designed to look like a human private body part, to give the impression to visiting foreign dignitaries, "Tier Americans are fertile. We have a lot of babies. I'll take over the world." Okay, what's the U.S. Treasury building supposed to be? If you need to ask, then you don't know too much about human anatomy. The smells of human body odor and human waste for most of history before the 19th century. I know we learn more about it as adults, but it really doesn't get talked about much in school. There were no hygiene practices, or at least very little, other than maybe a weekly rinse in some creek or pond, and let's not even get into human bodily waste. The smells had to be horrific. When I went to school, there was little mention of pirates and privateers. Blackbeard would basically tell people of all the adventures they go on, only to be sold as slaves. William Kidd was the only documented pirate to bury his treasure, and this is what got him executed. In many cases, all you had to do to stop a pirate's raid on your ship was to just offer them food and drink. Finally, many ships in World War II flew the Jolly Roger over their country's flags, mainly America. One example is USS Kidd, and it's still a tradition to fly the Jolly Roger whenever the current active USS Kidd arrives in port. Saved by a button. A bizarre incident in 1704 might have seen G.F. Handel's composing career cut tragically short after a set-to with fellow composer Johann Mattheson. For reasons apparently unknown, the two had a fierce quarrel in which Mattheson almost killed Handel with a sword, which fortunately struck a brass button on Handel's chest rather than the chest itself. Had that metal button not saved Handel's life, his famous Oratorio Messiah with its Hallelujah chorus would have never been composed. Hallelujah. I'm originally from Fiji. There is a phrase I love from a British general's journal, which I'll find as many opportunities as I can to quote. Indians were brought to Fiji to work the fields by the British because these Fijians have no concept of the industry. Once they have met the needs of the day, they simply leave and outrageously spend the rest of their time in leisure. Certain kinds of bosses haven't changed much, I reckon. This is a short version of history, but the White House, the presidential building belonging to the USA, got its name following the War of 1812. America failed to cross the Niagara River and invade Canada. The Canadian forces then crossed over the river, pushed the Americans back, and kept pushing deeper and deeper, all the way to the presidential building, and they set it on fire. Afterwards, the building was repainted entirely white, and thus became known as the White House. Paraguayan War. Solano Lopez took one of the poorest tactical decisions trying to fight the Brazilian Empire, Uruguay and Argentina at the time, and wiped out 90% of the male adult population in his country, sending the most industrialized country in the region back to the Dark Ages. The word checkmate means shamat, which also means the king is dead. So next time you beat someone and say checkmate, thinking your chess terminology is good, think again, you haven't won. This is really cool. Thanks for that. So I'm paraphrasing, but James Lafayette was a bondsman during the American Revolutionary War who joined the Continental Army serving under General Lafayette. He ended up becoming a spy, and because he could read and write, he would infiltrate the British Army and copy down plans to return to the American Army. It's believed that without his contribution, the British would have won the war. After the war, he returned to being a bondsman for 5 years. When he went to testify for his freedom, General Lafayette showed up to vouch for his contribution to the army, thus granting him his freedom. He took the name of Lafayette in honor of his commanding officer who helped him get his freedom and treated him like an equal during the war. The Children's Blizzard of 1888. An unexpected blizzard caused the temperature to drop as much as 50 degrees within a few hours during a mild school day. Children who went to school without coats were trapped in their schools without heat and no way to get home. About 235 people perished. You often hear about the festival of Bona Dea. What you wouldn't often hear about is how Claudius Pulcher was caught red-handed. For the uninitiated, the festival of Bona Dea was a female-only event for Roman women worshipping the good goddess. We know literally nothing about, other than that no men were allowed. And it was held at the chief priest's, Pontifex Maximus, aka Julius Caesar at this point, house. A certain Roman named Appius Claudius Pulcher wanted to live out every Roman boy's dream and infiltrate the festival. Got all dressed up and followed his wife and his girlfriend inside. We don't know how, but Caesar's mother caught him and chased him out. Here's the thing. She knew it was a guy, but didn't know which guy, though she suspected, and she was trusted enough in society that it got Claudius Pulcher in court. During his trial, Pulcher got all his buddies to claim that it was at some big shindig outside of town, at least a day's trip away. Very important. He had tons of witnesses, and he was about to be let go. That is, until Cicero, yes, that's Cicero, he got up from the back seat and said something along the lines of, "You weren't out of town. We talked in the forum that morning, remember? We specifically discussed the grain price." The sources also seem to agree that Cicero wasn't trying to be antagonistic, only that he had a terrible habit of telling the truth, or what he thought was best for Rome. Appius Claudius Pulcher was caught committing one of the worst acts of sacrilege, or at least the most scandalous that a Roman could think of, all because Cicero couldn't take a hint to keep his mouth shut.